All right, is this on? Yes. Hi, everyone. I guess I'm going to get started. Maybe there are still more people filtering in, but they should be able to catch up. Hi, my name is Kristina Lustig. Thank you so much for having me here in this lovely city. This is my first big conference talk and my first time in Lisbon, so I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about imposter syndrome, talking about how to take feelings related to imposter syndrome and reframe them into useful strategies for getting better at your work. So a little bit about me. I started working at Stack Overflow, which if you're not familiar, is a Q&A website for developers, in 2017 as their first user researcher. And in 2020, I changed careers and moved over into software development, which is where I am now. And I want to talk for a second about how different user research and software development are. To do user research, you're talking to the people who use your product all the time and helping to guide its development. But as an engineer, yes? Okay. As an engineer, you're actually, doing the development. So it's a big switch. So my background is in linguistics, human-computer interaction, and like I mentioned, user research. And because I figured I might be competing with maybe like post-lunchtime sleepiness, kind of a slump, I have my very adorable dog, Willow, here, who will help us learn about imposter syndrome. So let's dig in. First, in case you don't know what it is, let's define imposter syndrome, in case you've never experienced it yourself. So imposter syndrome is defined as the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own effort or skills. This can manifest in many ways, several of which I'll be talking about today. So why am I, in particular, qualified to talk about this? I'm not a psychologist or an actual expert in imposter syndrome. I haven't solved it, but I do have a lot of personal experience. So, like I mentioned, I've recently made a mid-career switch from design and research over to engineering with almost no formal computer science education. Just a lot of time spent making little games on the internet and doing coding puzzles. So this is a blog post that I made for Stack Overflow's blog talking about my career switch. And these are some of my silly little internet games in case you're curious. So here's a quote from that blog post that I mentioned where I talk a little bit about my own imposter syndrome. I wrote, "Sure, sometimes I submit a pull request for review and am subsequently embarrassed by the oversights I've made. And yeah, occasionally, but no more than a few times a day, I am absolutely positive I'm going to be fired for my obvious incompetence any second now." So yeah, a lot of personal experience with imposter syndrome. This is a text chat I had with my best friend from earlier this week. I was telling her I was feeling really nervous about this talk, and this is what she said. So that actually made me feel a lot less nervous. Cool, but just in case I'm not qualified enough, I sent out a survey to my engineering colleagues at Stack Overflow to get their thoughts and experiences with imposter syndrome, and I'll be referencing and quoting those throughout this talk today. Okay, so what sorts of thoughts does imposter syndrome cause? I'd like to share some of those common thoughts that I, and I'm sure others have, talk about situations in which they might appear, and then discuss how to reframe them into something more helpful. So here are a few of them. I have no idea what I'm doing. Everyone else knows more than I do, and I am somehow fooling everybody. These might sound familiar to you, or you might have others too. I'm sure if I sat down to write an entire list, this would be a much longer talk. So I'm going to focus on just these three. So let's start with this one. I have no idea what I'm doing. And what? Oh, switch? Okay, sorry, hold on a second. Okay, wow, I'm way louder. Okay. Okay, so let's start with I have no idea what I'm doing. In what sorts of situations might this thought crop up? Think for a moment about the last time you had this particular thought. For me, it was probably like today. So here are some scenarios that are familiar to me personally. When you're faced with a new problem, when you can't figure out a bug, when you're given a task and can't even figure out where to start. So how can we reframe this thought in these sorts of situations? I love this picture of her so much. I think this is maybe one of the most straightforward thoughts to reframe. If you have no idea what you're doing, and like I mentioned, I've definitely been there, there's a well-defined solution, which is seeking to understand, asking yourself, what can I do to understand this better? So let's talk about this first scenario, when you're faced with a new problem. It's really all about, I think, finding out how others have approached it, so searching for prior art. I might just be making a subtle plug for Stack Overflow, but anyway, this will be a bit of a theme throughout, talking to your colleagues, your coworkers, your fellow students, whatever. People generally love when you seek their advice, and the problem you're dealing with almost certainly isn't brand new. So one of my more experienced colleagues wrote in this survey that I mentioned earlier, it's not okay to know everything, sorry, it's okay, geez, it's okay not to know everything on day one. You picked a career where you will learn things that won't even be relevant 5 years from now. We're all constantly learning. So continuing to view new and difficult challenges as opportunities to learn is a great way to mitigate the stress you might be feeling surrounding these challenges. And it's kind of buzzwordy right now, but the concept of having a growth mindset from Carol Dweck helps a lot here as well. So she writes, individuals who believe their talents can be developed through hard work, good strategies, and input from others have a growth mindset. They tend to achieve more than those with a more fixed mindset, those who believe their talents are innate gifts. So believing that you can understand and do more than you currently can help a lot with actually achieving and understanding more. Okay, so let's talk about the second situation here. If you're like me and coming from a non-computer science background, and you're trying to figure out a bug, you might actually have insight that someone with that formal background might not even see. So here's a little comic that I made to illustrate. You can see she's looking at this big, shiny, perfect apple from one side and can't see the sneaky little worm on the other side. And this isn't a whole talk about debugging, but just to explain what I mean, fixing a bug isn't just about reproducing it. Even though that helps, there are a few other strategies I've found to be particularly effective in getting yourself out of that rut and figuring out what's wrong. So the first is documenting how everything works. So in the process of documenting, you might find an additional facet of the stuff you were working on that maybe you didn't notice before, but worst case, now your code has much better documentation. Also, looking for external factors can help a lot. Sometimes the bug isn't with your code at all, it's with maybe a browser-specific issue or even user error. And then finally, you can rubber duck the problem. This, if you don't know what that means explaining the problem to someone, anyone, even a rubber duck, because that can help you find errors you might have otherwise missed. Also, the number of times that I have been stumped by a bug and then asked someone much more senior than me about the bug and have them be stumped too is a lot of times. So finding different ways of approaching a problem like this can help you find the solution. And the last scenario here, when you're given a task and can't figure out where to start. The best approach here, in my experience, is to break the task down into the tiniest manageable pieces. Let me give an example. Here's a basic task that one might get in the course of doing their job. Add a contact form to the website. So that seems like a small, self-contained little project maybe, but it can actually be broken down quite a bit. So first, you can just break it down into get the designs in text for the form, write the front-end code that the user interacts with, write the back-end code, and those can be broken down even further to the point where maybe it even seems ridiculous, like message the designer, write the HTML, write the JavaScript, create the route, write tests to make sure everything works, and then if you're like me, you'll eventually end up with little code comments throughout your code telling you what you actually need to do to accomplish what you're doing. I find that strategy helps a lot with breaking down tasks that can sometimes feel like a mountain. So there are certainly other scenarios where you might face this particular imposter syndrome-y thought. I have no idea what I'm doing. But those were just a few ideas to help you seek to understand your problem instead of just kind of throwing your hands up in the air. Okay, so next. Everyone else knows more than I do. These are funny, like little sound bites that someone's gonna have in the recording, me just saying, everyone else knows more than I do. Anyway, so I would be remiss if I didn't include the relevant XKCD comic here. So in case you can't read it from there, the first person says, "This is Dr. Adams. She's a social psychologist and the world's top expert on imposter syndrome." And then Dr. Adams says, "Ha, don't be silly. There are lots of scholars who have made more significant," oh my God. So pretty relevant. Okay, so everyone else knows more than I do. At my job, full of a bunch of the smartest people I've ever met, I feel like this a lot. So how can we reframe this thought into a more helpful mental refrain? So first, it's almost certainly not true that everyone knows more than you do. This is such a common imposter syndrome thought. You've probably seen this particular framing of the problem on the internet before. I can't take credit for it, but it illustrates this particular facet of imposter syndrome perfectly. It seems like everyone else has all of this knowledge that you don't, but in reality, everyone has their own niche. So the question you can ask yourself is, what is my niche? Keeping the idea of your own particular areas of expertise in mind makes it much easier to face these various situations. Willow's niche, for example, is carrying around stuffed burritos. So let's talk about this first scenario, when someone explains a concept and you don't get it. I cannot count the number of times I've sat in a meeting and everyone is confused about what's happening and no one says anything until the meeting is over. Why would we do that? It can be scary to speak up in a situation like that. But more often than not, other people have the exact same question. Don't do it like I did here, though. I just did a Slack search for me using the phrase "stupid question" with my colleagues. That's not helpful. Talking down to yourself in this situation doesn't help anything, and the only stupid questions are the ones that don't get asked, is what I tell myself. Okay, so this next scenario. when a colleague says something is easy. So the pretext here is that a colleague thinks it's easy, but you do not, and that's the issue. So I distinctly remember a time when a coworker was helping me with a task, and he said, "Oh, it's easy, just use bitwise operators." And I was like, "Oh yeah, okay." And then I was like scrambling to Google what bitwise operators were so I could nod my head in agreement, but I was really just embarrassed that I didn't know what they were. So in situations like that, you can contextualize that statement. In that particular situation, my coworker had many years of experience and a formal degree, so bitwise operators were, to him, a piece of cake. So why would I assume that I should magically know everything that someone who's had 10 times longer than me to learn? And then flip that situation around a little bit. Let's say that you're a person with several years of experience and you're mentoring a new intern. Would you expect them to hop into the job and start like churning out work right away? No, of course not. So why would you expect that for yourself? One of my colleagues writes, "Remember that everyone starts from different places. Even other people breaking into tech don't necessarily start in the same place. Some people start with a strong math background, and others may have a strong background in design." One thing I tell myself pretty frequently when I'm feeling especially worried about my knowledge and skill set, which is maybe a little silly, is there's a whole wide world of people out there who code for a living. There's no way that I am the very worst developer. And it sounds silly, but it actually really does help. Okay, so moving on to the next one. When it takes you twice as long as someone else to get the same amount of work done. As I mentioned before, why would you be able to get a task done as fast as someone who's been doing the same task for years? That's like me picking up a paintbrush for the first time and then getting upset that I'm not cranking out Picassos. It makes no sense. Remember what I said earlier about growth mindset? It takes time and effort to improve at something. And that thing might not even end up being your area of expertise, and that's okay. My colleague writes, "At this point in my career, I have to come to terms with the fact that it is literally impossible to make time to be an expert in all technologies and skills I'm interested in. So it's okay to be bad at some of them in order to make time to be good at others." So let's look at this last one. When you don't pass a technical interview. It happens, right? Like, it happens. Interviewing is really hard, and technical interviews especially. I've seen, from a hiring perspective, across several different kinds of careers, more people fail them than not. The important thing here is to not let it spiral into imposter syndrome-y feelings of inadequacy. You can learn from what didn't go well in that particular circumstance and know that there will be more opportunities for you ahead. My colleague writes, "Don't sweat not knowing something. The type of people you will enjoy working with care much more about your willingness to learn than they do about you not knowing something." So once you've reframed this thought, everyone else knows more than I do, and figured out what your niche is, these scenarios become much easier to approach. Finally, our last thought. I am somehow fooling everybody. Do you ever have that little voice in your head saying, "Ha, you tricked everybody into thinking you're competent and you're not. What if they find out?" Me too. This thought crops up a lot when you're comparing yourself to your colleagues. Here are some scenarios in which this might happen. When you're the least experienced developer on your team, when you're embarrassed by how difficult you found your last project, when you had to ask for help several times to complete a task, or when you're wondering why and how you even still have a job. So let's talk through these scenarios and about how to change your mindset. So instead of being positive, you'll be found out at some point that you're an imposter, flip that around and figure out what value you actually bring to your work or class or hobby or whatever, and ask, what do I bring to the table? Let's assume you're not fooling anybody. What is there that has gotten you to where you are that you can't see yourself? Do you offer a fresh perspective? Are you really good at a particular facet of engineering, like documentation or communicating with designers on your team? Find out what that thing is and know it and remember it. So let's talk about this first one, when you're the least experienced developer on your team. I love being the least experienced developer on my team. Like, okay, sometimes I'm very anxious about it for obvious reasons. Sure, sometimes it means that I have to slow the conversation down a bit to make sure that I'm understanding everything we're talking about, not getting lost, but it also means that I'm learning way more than I would otherwise. Here's another little comic that I made to illustrate. I'll give you a second to look at it. So it's wonderful having someone to work closely with and also learn from. My colleague writes, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. It can feel overwhelming to put yourself into a situation where you have the least amount of experience or knowledge, but these are your best opportunities to learn. Okay, so have you ever been in a situation where you worked on something and thought, that should have been way easier than it was for me? What's wrong with me? So when you're embarrassed by how difficult you found your last project, instead take a moment to think about how you've changed as a result of completing the task. What did you learn? My colleague writes, remember that you don't have to know everything all the time, and the bigger skill is to know how to figure things out. People joke all the time about how the most important thing a developer can know how to do is to look things up on the internet, but that's at least partially true. Okay, so when you've had to ask for help several times to complete a task, sometimes you just get really stuck, you get some help, and then you get stuck again and again and again. But what's way worse than asking for help a fourth or fifth time? Not getting help at all, and then veering way off track in that situation and not completing your project, and then not learning how to improve for the next time you face a similar task. Here's something I wrote to a few coworkers in Slack last month when we were all working on a really difficult project. I wrote, I spent all day feeling unhelpful since I needed to ask for help for literally everything I tried to work on. I felt so anxious and worried that everyone I was working with was thinking about how useless I am. So this is actually a classic cognitive distortion, mind reading, thinking that I know what everyone else is thinking. I was sure that everyone was just consumed with their thoughts of my own inadequacy. I assumed that I was the only one struggling in a really difficult situation. But in reality, everyone was struggling and needing to ask for help constantly because it was a really tough project. So opening up about this to my coworkers started a conversation about how everyone was actually just feeling the same way. So sometimes the imposter syndrome can get so bad, you're positive that everyone can tell you're flailing. But how will you know unless you ask? So this is something a therapist taught me years ago that has stuck with me. Let's assume that you're having an extra bad day and you're positive that you're about to be fired. You know your boss is about to tell you what a bad job you're doing. It's really easy to enter this anxiety spiral and let it spin out of control into this black pit of despair at the center. So how do we fix that? Data. Ask yourself, what data do I have to support this thought? What data do I have to refute it? Data is your life preserver here, and if you don't have it, get it. You could review performance reviews if your job has those. You could engage in self-reflection, maybe writing down the things that you've passed, the things that you've accomplished in the past few months. You could also ask your manager or a teacher how you're doing, ask your colleagues what else they need from you. Using this data to rescue you out of this spiral can really help you break this cycle of negative self-talk. So even in these difficult situations, feelings of inadequacy don't have to win. Employing a bit of humility and putting yourself out there a bit can really help. So let's sum these up. I have no idea what I'm doing becomes, what can I do to understand? Everyone else knows more than I do becomes, what is my niche? And I am somehow fooling everybody becomes, what do I bring to the table? So I think these can actually be broken down a little bit further. Ultimately, to use your imposter syndrome to help and not hurt yourself, you just have to do a few things. Learn. Learn from your experiences, learn from those around you. Specialize. Find your niche and know it and remember it. Find something to specialize in or to make your particular expertise. Even if your niche happens to be that you are a generalist, find that thing and know it. And finally, recognize. Don't forget why you're here. Recognize your strengths and your value, and don't waste time comparing yourself to others. I'll end with what I think is a really useful quote that I think about frequently. Comparison is the thief of joy. Ultimately, imposter syndrome isn't about other people, it's about you, and you're the one who can change it. Thanks. I can answer any questions you have, or if you'd rather ask them one-on-one, I think I'm going to be over there in that corner later, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for your wonderful keynote, Kristina. Does anyone have questions? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. You're a great speaker, obviously. But I also have a question about not exactly measures after it's happened, because when you feel that way, but do you have any way to stop that from ever happening, or do you have any kind of system that you use to try to stop it from even happening, from feeling that way?
Yeah, so I guess first I should say that any system I have isn't perfect, because I obviously still struggle with this, but I think it's all about practice. So recognizing when you're having these sorts of thoughts that can tend to spiral negatively, and then catching yourself in the act and reframing it in the moment, and just doing that over and over again will eventually kind of retrain your brain into thinking about things more positively.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question, not exactly on imposter syndrome, but I was just curious with your whole background going from design to software engineering. How was making the decision and how, I'm guessing you had a lot of fear at the time about the decision, and how did you overcome it? And yeah, it's more for me about chasing your dreams, and how did you decide to go for it?
Yeah, it was very scary. So I was working as a researcher, like I mentioned, and then I was actually the director of design at Stack Overflow, so I was running the whole design team. And I went to my manager at the time and told her, like, hey, I think I have to quit. I want to go pursue being a software engineer. And then she asked me, why don't you just do that here? So I took a pay cut and spent a lot of time like building up my skills in areas that I didn't know. So we used .NET at work, so I had to learn all about that, which I had never used. It was really scary to switch jobs, but I had the benefit of working with colleagues that I had already known for several years and who already knew me and knew that I was going to try as hard as I could to be good at this new role. So I think that was a huge advantage that I wasn't working with new people, and that helped mitigate a lot of those fears.
Does anyone else have more questions for Kristina?
Hi. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask if we are part of a team and we know someone is struggling with imposter syndrome and self-doubt and things like that, how can we approach them and help them? So being on the other side of the spectrum of what you just said.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that always making sure you're giving feedback to your colleagues can help a lot. So if you're giving colleagues both constructive and positive feedback on a regular basis, I think they're way more likely to believe the positive stuff if you're not just giving them positive feedback. So definitely making sure that you're being like honest with them and establishing that sort of rapport can help a lot. And then maybe just ask them what they need from you. Sometimes it can be really scary to even ask for help if you're struggling because, you know, you're worried that you're going to look like you don't know what you're doing. So removing that need for them to ask and offering help could also be helpful. It kind of depends on the person, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have questions? I'm not seeing anyone, so I think not.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Next up,
Agora vai ao palco e escolhe o hino.
okay.